The last thing Daniel Weston expected to see as he walked into the all-night diner was a woman with tired eyes balancing 3 plates on one arm while soothing a crying toddler on her hip. But there she was, Ava Mitchell, moving with quiet determination, her expression carefully guarded as though she was holding the weight of the world on her shoulders. Daniel had only stepped in for a late-night coffee after a grueling meeting. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to notice her. But something about the way she moved, efficient, graceful despite her exhaustion, made it impossible to look away. "Order up, Ava," the cook called from the kitchen. Ava let out a breath, shifting the toddler, her son. Daniel assumed higher on her hip and offering a weary smile to the cook. "Thanks, Joe." She set the plates down in front of a couple in the next booth before hurrying back to the counter, bouncing the child gently as she grabbed a notepad. Daniel watched as she moved from table to table, her uniform slightly too big, her shoes worn down. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. And yet she smiled at every customer like she had no choice but to keep pushing forward. When she finally reached his booth, she pulled out her notepad, not looking up. "What can I get you?" Her voice was soft, but there was something underneath it, fatigue maybe, or hesitation. "Just coffee," Daniel said, studying her carefully. She finally glanced up, and for a moment her green eyes met his. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was gone just as fast. She didn't know who he was. That was a rarity in his world. He wanted to ask her why she was here so late, why she was juggling a toddler while working, why she looked like she carried the weight of 1,000 burdens, but he had no right. She was a stranger. Ava nodded, scribbling down the order before hurrying away. Daniel leaned back, watching her. He wasn't the kind of man who involved himself in other people's lives. He had built his empire, Weston Enterprises, from the ground up, and he had no time for distractions. But something about Ava made it impossible to look away. Minutes later, she returned with his coffee, setting it down quickly before turning to leave. "Is he your son?" Daniel asked before he could stop himself. Ava stiffened. "Yes," Daniel nodded, glancing at the boy who had finally fallen asleep against her shoulder. "You work late," she sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I work whenever they'll let me." His jaw tightened. "This is one of your jobs," Ava let out a humorless laugh. "One of 3. Daniel didn't know why that hit him so hard. 3 jobs. A child to take care of, and yet she was standing here doing what had to be done. Before he could say anything else, the cook called her name again. She gave Daniel a small nod before rushing off. He didn't leave right away. He sat there, drinking his coffee, watching as she worked until well past midnight. He had never seen someone work so hard, push themselves so relentlessly, and still have the grace to smile at the people around them. As he finally stood to leave, he slipped a few $100 bills beneath his coffee cup, more than enough to cover the drink and then some. Ava didn't see him go. But when she returned to clear the table, she froze, staring at the money like it was a mirage. Daniel walked out into the night, hands in his pockets, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. He had never expected to care. But for some reason, he did. Daniel hadn't planned on returning to the diner. In fact, after leaving that night, he'd told himself it was just a passing moment of interest, fleeting curiosity, nothing more. But 3 days later, he found himself parked outside the all-night diner again, watching through the window as Ava moved from table to table. She looked just as tired as before, but there was something else: determination, resilience. It was in the way she carried herself, how she didn't let exhaustion slow her down. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't like him. He wasn't the type to get involved in people's lives, especially not strangers. He didn't have time for distractions, and yet here he was. Before he could overthink it, he stepped inside. The moment he entered, the warm scent of coffee and grilled food filled the air. The place was half full, a mix of late-night workers and weary travelers occupying the booths. Ava was at the counter, balancing a tray with one hand while flipping through a notepad with the other. Her son wasn't with her tonight. Daniel took a seat at the same booth as before, waiting. It didn't take long. She turned, caught sight of him, and for a brief second, her brows lifted in recognition. But just as quickly, she schooled her features into something unreadable, walking over with her notepad in hand. "You're back," she said, her voice neutral. Daniel nodded. "Coffee," she scribbled it down. "Anything else?" He hesitated. "No." Ava didn't linger. She turned away, weaving through the tables with the same efficiency as before. Daniel leaned against the booth, watching her interact with customers. She spoke politely but briefly, never stopping longer than necessary. There was a guardedness to her, a quiet strength that made him even more curious. When she returned with the coffee, she set it down swiftly. "Here you go." Daniel glanced at her, noting the faint shadows under her eyes. "You always work this late," she exhaled through her nose, adjusting the strap of her apron. "Whenever they need me." It wasn't much of an answer, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached for the coffee, taking a slow sip. Ava hesitated before speaking again. "Last time you left a ridiculous amount of money." Daniel didn't react. "Was it not enough?" She blinked, clearly thrown off by the question. "It was too much." He set his cup down, meeting her gaze. "You work hard, seemed fair." Her expression shifted, as if she wasn't sure whether to be grateful or suspicious. "I don't take charity." His lips curved slightly. "It wasn't charity, it was a tip." Ava studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. "Well, I don't need another one like that." Daniel arched a brow. "Noted." She lingered for a second longer, as if debating whether to say something else, but then she turned and walked away. Daniel exhaled, watching as she moved back behind the counter. She intrigued him not just because of her situation, but because of how fiercely independent she was. This wasn't something he could walk away from. Not yet. Daniel hadn't meant to follow through on his curiosity, but Ava had taken root in his mind, a persistent thought that refused to be ignored. It had been a week since his last visit to the diner, and though he'd told himself to leave it alone, he found himself sitting in the back seat of his car, staring at the entrance of a daycare center. She was there, standing near the door, her arms crossed as she spoke to a staff member. Unlike her diner uniform, she was now in a plain, fitted sweater and jeans, her hair pulled into a neat bun. There was no exhaustion in her posture, only quiet determination. The woman she was speaking to shook her head, and Daniel watched as Ava's shoulders stiffened. Her hands curled into fists for a moment before she exhaled, nodding once. The woman gave her a sympathetic look, but Ava didn't linger. She turned and walked away, her face unreadable. Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped out of his car and made his way toward her. She didn't notice him at first, her attention focused on pulling out her phone. But as she looked up, her eyes locked onto his and she halted mid-step. He saw it immediately, the flicker of wariness, the hesitation. "You," she said, her voice carrying both surprise and suspicion. Daniel stopped a few feet away. "Me." She studied him, as if trying to figure out why he was standing in front of her. "Are you following me?" "No," he answered honestly. "I was in the area." Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't call him out on it. Instead, she sighed, slipping her phone into her pocket. "Everything all right?" he asked before he could stop himself. Ava hesitated, then shrugged. "Just a minor issue with the daycare." Daniel didn't miss the way she clenched her fingers, the way her shoulders stiffened again. It wasn't minor. Without thinking, he said, "What kind of issue?" Her lips pressed together, and for a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't answer. But then, as if deciding there was no point in hiding it, she spoke. "They're raising their fees, again." "I can't afford it." The words were blunt, matter of fact, but Daniel saw the frustration beneath them. He frowned. "How much?" Ava let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "I'm not discussing my finances with you." Daniel didn't push. Instead, he glanced at the daycare building behind her, then back at her. "You work too much as it is." She let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. That's not exactly a choice. Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. Before he could respond, she exhaled, rubbing the side of her neck. Look, I appreciate the concern, but I'll figure it out. I always do. Daniel believed her, but that didn't mean he liked it. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. What if you didn't have to? Ava's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Daniel hesitated, then chose his words carefully. I'm looking for an assistant, temporary, flexible hours, pay that would cover whatever you need. She stared at him. Then she shook her head. That's not, before you say no, just think about it, he interrupted. It's better than running yourself into the ground. Ava exhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. This isn't charity. No, he said firmly. It's a job. She searched his face for a long moment as if trying to find the catch. Finally, she sighed. I'll think about it. Daniel nodded. That's all I ask. She didn't thank him. She didn't give any indication that she'd actually consider it. But as she turned and walked away, Daniel had the distinct feeling that the walls she had so carefully built were beginning to crack. Ava stared at the sleek office building, its glass windows reflecting the city lights like a beacon of a world she didn't belong to. Yet here she was, standing in front of Weston Enterprises, gripping the strap of her worn-out purse as she tried to steady her breath. She had told herself 100 times that she wouldn't come. That accepting Daniel Weston's offer meant stepping into something she couldn't afford, something beyond a paycheck. But the moment she had looked into her son's eyes that morning and seen the exhaustion mirrored in his tiny face, the decision had been made for her. A security guard greeted her at the entrance, his radio crackling as he nodded toward the reception desk. The moment she stepped inside, the sheer luxury of the place made her hesitate. Polished marble floors stretched beneath her feet, and the scent of expensive cologne and fresh coffee filled the air. She didn't belong here. But before doubt could take hold, a familiar voice broke through the hum of the office. You came. Ava turned, finding Daniel standing a few feet away, his gaze steady. He was dressed in a tailored dark suit, his presence commanding even in the midst of the bustling office. There was no surprise in his expression, just quiet expectation. She swallowed hard. I said I'd think about it. His lips twitched slightly. And you did, she exhaled, gripping her purse tighter. I need the job, nothing more. He gave a slow nod, his eyes never leaving hers. Noted. Without another word, he gestured for her to follow. Ava trailed behind him, her heart pounding as they moved through the hallways. Employees glanced up as they passed, their curiosity evident. She could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions. But Daniel didn't slow, didn't offer an explanation. When they reached his office, he pushed the door open, revealing a space that was both minimalist and undeniably powerful. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city's skyline, and a massive desk sat at the center, its surface immaculately organized. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. You'll work directly with me. No coffee runs, no errands, just assistance with projects, scheduling, and anything else that needs handling. Ava nodded, forcing herself to meet his gaze. And the pay? He named a figure that made her stomach tighten. It was more than she had expected, more than she could have hoped for. She hesitated, searching his face for any sign of pity. But there was none. Instead, there was something else, something unreadable. Finally, she exhaled. All right. Daniel extended a hand. Welcome aboard, Ava. She hesitated only a second before shaking it. His grip was firm, warm. And for reasons she couldn't understand, that single touch sent a ripple of something unfamiliar through her. She pulled back quickly. When do I start? His gaze flickered over her, assessing. Now. Her stomach clenched, but she nodded. Okay, Daniel gestured toward the desk opposite his. You'll set up there. Ava moved to the chair, sinking into it as she tried to ignore the way her pulse hammered in her throat. She could do this. She had to. But as she glanced at Daniel, who was already focused on his laptop, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a job. It was the beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready for. Ava sank into her chair, fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the desk. It was strange, this world of quiet efficiency, the hum of hushed conversations, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards. It was nothing like the chaos of the diner or the mind-numbing repetition of her second job at the warehouse. Here, everything was pristine, deliberate. It almost felt like stepping onto another planet. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself. This was just a job, no different from any other. The only difference was the pay, the lifeline that would finally allow her to breathe. Daniel sat across from her, his eyes skimming his laptop screen. He hadn't spoken much since she arrived, only giving her a brief rundown of her tasks. Schedule management, correspondence filtering, assisting with high-priority projects, nothing she couldn't handle. But still, there was an undercurrent of something between them. A tension not quite uncomfortable, but charged nonetheless. A soft knock at the door interrupted the silence. A woman stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was tall, effortlessly poised, dressed in a navy blue pencil dress that fit her like it had been made for her. Her gaze flicked to Ava, assessing her with a single glance before shifting to Daniel. "You didn't mention you hired someone new," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. Daniel barely looked up. "I don't announce every decision I make, Celeste." Ava noted the familiarity in the way she spoke to him, the way her gaze lingered on him a beat too long. Celeste turned back to Ava, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Weston Enterprises. I assume you'll be assisting Daniel?" Ava nodded. "That's right," Celeste hummed, tilting her head slightly. "Well, I hope you can keep up. He's not exactly known for his patience." Daniel finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "I think she'll manage." There was something final in his tone, something that made Celeste's lips press together briefly before she straightened. "I have the finalized reports for the Singapore deal. I'll leave them with your assistant then." She placed a thick folder on Ava's desk, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping it once before she turned on her heel and exited the room. Ava exhaled quietly, reaching for the folder. She searched for the right word. Daniel smirked slightly. "Direct, that's one way to put it. You'll get used to her." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Unless you regret taking the job already." Ava met his gaze, steady. "No. I need this." Something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place, but he only nodded, returning his attention to his laptop. The rest of the day passed in a blur of emails, scheduling adjustments, and reports that required meticulous review. Ava fell into the rhythm of the job quickly, surprising even herself. It was different from what she was used to, but not impossible. By the time the office began emptying out, she stretched her arms, stealing a glance at Daniel. He was still focused on his screen, his jaw tight with concentration. Ava hesitated before speaking. "Do you ever stop working?" He glanced at her, amusement flickering across his face. "Do you?" She huffed a soft laugh. "Fair point." He leaned back, watching her for a moment. "How was your first day?" She considered the question. "Not as terrifying as I expected." His lips twitched. "Good, I'd hate to scare you off so soon." She rolled her eyes, standing and gathering her things. "I'll see you tomorrow then." Daniel nodded, but just as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Ava," she turned. "If you ever need anything beyond work, let me know." Something about the way he said it, quiet but firm, sent a strange warmth through her. She held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding. "Good night, Daniel." And with that, she stepped out, her heart beating just a little faster than before. Ava had expected the adjustment to working at Weston Enterprises to be difficult, but after 2 weeks, she found herself slipping into the rhythm of the job with surprising ease. She had learned to anticipate Daniel's needs before he voiced them, had mastered the art of navigating between executives and clients, and had even managed to decipher his mood based on the subtle shifts in his expression. What she hadn't expected was how much she liked working with him. Daniel was demanding, yes, but never unreasonable. He respected competence, valued efficiency, and despite his often unreadable demeanor, he had a way of making her feel like she belonged in his world. It was dangerous. Because the more time she spent with him, the more she caught herself noticing things she shouldn't. The way his sleeves were always rolled up by midday, revealing strong forearms. The way his voice softened ever so slightly when they worked late. The way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was foolish to think about any of it, so she didn't. At least she tried not to. Tonight, however, ignoring it became impossible. The office had long since emptied, leaving only the two of them. Ava was finishing up a report when Daniel spoke. "Come with me," he said, standing without further explanation. She blinked, surprised. "Where?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his coat and gestured for her to follow. Ava hesitated before sighing and rising from her chair. She trailed behind him as they stepped into the private elevator, the doors closing with a quiet hum. Moments later, they emerged onto the rooftop. The view was breathtaking, a sweeping panorama of the city lights stretching into the horizon. A soft breeze carried the scent of rain, and for a moment she forgot why they were here at all. She turned to him. "What is this?" Daniel leaned against the railing, looking out over the city. "You've been working hard, too hard." Ava crossed her arms. "That's the job, isn't it?" he exhaled, glancing at her. "It doesn't have to be," she frowned. "Daniel, you never stop," he interrupted, his gaze intense. "You take care of everyone but yourself. You've spent so much time surviving that you don't even realize when someone wants to take care of you." Ava's breath hitched. The words struck something deep inside her, something she had buried long ago. She shook her head. I know," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean you don't deserve it." Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Ava swallowed hard, looking away. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Because I can't stop thinking about you." The confession sent a jolt through her, stealing the air from her lungs. She turned to face him fully, searching his expression for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. "You're my boss," she said, though the words came out weaker than she intended. Daniel stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "That's not why you're hesitating." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, because he was right. She wasn't hesitating because of their professional relationship. She was hesitating because she was terrified. Terrified of what it would mean to want him. Terrified of what it would mean if he wanted her back. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing against hers. It was the barest touch, but it sent heat rushing through her veins. "You can push me away if that's what you want," he murmured, "but I don't think you do." Ava stared at him, her heart pounding. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she closed the distance between them. Daniel didn't hesitate. His hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her against him as his lips met hers. It wasn't soft, it wasn't careful, it was a collision fierce, consuming, inevitable. Ava lost herself in him. When they finally pulled apart, her breath was unsteady, her pulse racing. Daniel's forehead rested against hers. "Tell me this isn't just me," he murmured. Ava exhaled shakily. "It's not." And just like that, the walls she had spent years building came crashing down.